Welcome to Me Reimagined, a space where we step into the impossible version of ourselves, a version we only dream of, so we can create lives we love and the impact we are meant to make.
On today's podcast, Megan and I are sitting down to have a conversation heart to heart. We are talking about the experiences that we've had in our lives where people around us haven't necessarily understood or agreed with the direction that we're going in and how we've dealt with that both in the past and now. Why working on ourselves is actually fun, and how using humor to make self development joyful is such a powerful tool and one that we apply all the time in our programs and in our work. We also talk about how some small tweaks and changes have made massive impact in our lives. And we touch on how both of us are just addicted to stretching our comfort zones. So if you can relate to that, then this is definitely an episode you don't want to miss. So let's jump right in.
One of the things that strikes me about our journey is that we met before either one of us started doing any of this work. And in some cases, in relationships, when one or the other starts doing the work, I found that you grow apart. But what's interesting is that as we did this work, we grew closer.
That's true, yeah. It can go either way. I think when you have friends that start doing the work, it can either trigger you or you can let it trigger you because it reveals the areas of your life that you're unwilling to work on or where you feel stuck. Or you can see it as inspiration.
It's funny that resonates with me a lot because I can remember somebody would say they were doing meditation before I started meditating, or they would go running, and I would not celebrate. In fact, I would almost label them as more boring or something like that. And you're right. When I started doing it, I then started celebrating that in others and supporting it. And it makes a difference. I think that leads me to think about community and the community that you surround yourself with and how much of a difference it makes in terms of supporting your journey and helping you see possibility and to keep going when it gets difficult. Because I think those are the times where we often stop. So let's say you start a journey where you're meditating or you start making changes in your life. And how many times have you done that? Start, stop, and then you actually don't get anywhere?
Yeah, for sure. And then I think it's also a case of timing. I've been exposed to the same thing over and over and over again. And sometimes you need to hear it at the right time and from the right source. And you never know what that source is. Could be your friend, or it could be, a podcast. It could be a course. It could be whatever. It could be just a random Instagram post. But there's something about where you're at and what's being served you at that time. And sometimes it's just not the right time to take something in or to take action on it.
Yeah, and I think it's that thing where, let's say you pick it up 5 times and you notice it and you agree with it and you like it, or you maybe even put a sticky note on your mirror. But there will be a time where it begins to hit differently, where suddenly the uptake becomes a lot more holistic rather than theoretical, where it's no longer outside of you, it's inside of you. It's almost like the seeds germinated, but then you can feel they begin to take root. But I'm curious, 2 things come up for me. One is that, so just like information can come in and you can not be ready to receive it, and then suddenly you are and you begin to holistically move it. What came up for me the first time is that life also gives you the lessons, right? It serves you right up the challenge that you haven't overcome. And until you're ready to move through that challenge differently, life just serves it back to you. And I got probably the same lesson at least 20 times because I'm a hard-headed learner. And I like to bang my head against the wall to learn things rather than just absorbing them. I think it's getting easier now to absorb the life lessons with grace rather than running into the brick wall each time. But I guess I'm curious, is there a lesson that life has served you multiple times that it took you a while to get your head around?
Yes, there is definitely a lesson that I have learned multiple times. And That is also why I've quit 7 different jobs in my life. So I'm a person that thrives on growth, learning and growth. That's what keeps me going. It's what energizes me. It's one of my core values. And I've experienced in different ways, in different jobs, the feeling of being stuck because I'm no longer evolving and no longer growing, but also the feeling of being uncomfortable in a particular space because I'm expected to be a certain way or I feel a pressure to be a certain way. And that has come up for me time and time again in my life. And it's something that I have worked through in different ways. And it has resulted in me taking scary leaps several times out of jobs without really having a plan for the future, but trusting that if I follow my desire for growth and learning, if I follow what feels right intuitively, I'll figure it out as I go.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for tolerating discomfort because how often have you done that thing where, at least this happened in my journey a lot, where it feels so uncomfortable, you disappoint yourself because it is less uncomfortable than disappointing other people. And so, whatever that is, you abandon yourself to make it okay for them. And then, when you finally learn that actually doesn't get you anywhere and you start to expand your ability to sit with that discomfort, wow, your choices change so much. What is one, I guess, as a result of learning to sit with the discomfort, rather than a major change, what is a small decision that had a major impact? So I'll give you an example for me. I didn't love to meditate at all. And I really, in the times that you most need meditation, is when your brain is going in your head and mine doesn't shut up. It is like one of those wind up toys that doesn't ever unwind. It wasn't until I was in my 40s that I found breath work. And that is a small decision that I made that has radically changed my life. So externally, not much changed, meaning I didn't suddenly quit my job. I didn't suddenly start a relationship, but it is something that has helped me keep my mood up and forward, has helped me channel my energy, has helped me roll like I'm surfing through the uncertainty in life rather than that feeling of being, when something's happening, you feel like you have no control and you feel like you're being tossed about by life and it hurts and you're crashing into things and you're blind and you fight that internal conflict. The breath work, a lot of it disappeared because of that. It's like it takes me to a different plane. And so I started doing it every day, even if it's only 5 to 8 minutes. I do it. And if I can do it, I do it much longer, like an hour, because life feels and looks different after I do that. So I think that's a small decision that you make just to start picking up a small morning practice. And then it radically shifts how you see the world, the choices you make, how you feel when you move through it, how you impact people. And suddenly life starts to look a lot more extraordinary than it did before you started doing 5 minutes of breath work every day.
Yeah, I love that. And breathwork has definitely had a similar impact on my life as well. What came to me when you were talking now was when I was living in a tiny house. I lived in a tiny house for 2 years, and we were placed in this really beautiful countryside location where we were in a large garden, and we had, like, the view over fields, just fields and fields and farmland. It was very pretty. But it was the first time I had access to a garden, and I've never thought of myself as a person who would do gardening, or I've never thought of myself as someone with a green thumb at all. I tend to kill all the plants that I come in contact with. But when we were there, so the people we rented the property from, they had a greenhouse, a simple one. So we put that up, or my husband put that up for me, so that I could plant things. And this is the first time I've done it, and I just decided I was going to give it a try, and it impacted my life in surprising ways because to me it was, trying something new, learning a new skill. But it got me outside. It got me to take breaks from work or other things, being outside, getting more sun. The fact of just having your hands in the dirt and not really thinking about anything else was very meditative. I did not expect that.
Yeah, I do too. It's funny. You ever look at your parents when you were younger and you're like, Christ, I'm never going to spend this much time in the gardens. Like old people love gardening or old people love birds. That was what was in my
Exactly.
head. And then here I am, like fairly early 30s, and I'm starting to be like, I want a garden. And then that only compounded my sense that 30 is so old. And then now that I'm well past 30, I suddenly think I was a baby. Um, and the love of gardening has never changed. But I think there's something grounding about it, something that puts you back in touch with what matters, what's really important when the world, I mean, the pace of this world has just accelerated. Literally every down moment we have is taken up with some sort of filler. There's no silence
Yeah.
in lives. We move from on the tram, everybody's got their heads down. And it's so funny because I start smiling at people and they think, who's this creepy one looking at me? But I'm looking at them to make contact and smile and share the joy of just being together, being human, living the beauty of this existence. And I think being in the garden, putting your hands in the soil reminds you of that. It gives you a moment of freedom. That is literally what I think of it as, freedom, because you're free from all of the stimulation and the noise and the go, go, go. And it's grounding, it's calm, it's centering, it brings you back.
Yeah, and it's
You.
literally grounding. You're touching the earth, you're touching the ground. Not only does it give you mind space, it gives you a physical grounding to the earth, which was surprisingly soothing and meditative.
There are studies that prove that hugging trees now actually releases oxytocin in your system. And that's the love drug. That's why we love being in love. All the good things start flooding your body. And so just to spend 5 minutes pressed to a tree with your arms around it and in contact, your skin contact with it is the same, I think, as like a small infant being hugged to their parent's chest, skin to skin kind of thing. And so there are trees in cities everywhere. It may require that you're in Central Plaza somewhere and you're like hugging on a tree and everyone's looking at you. But if you can lose yourself in that moment, you can get that connection. You can center yourself. What is it that made you wake up? How did you go from being asleep, let's say, being unaware, to suddenly waking up and being aware? Can you talk to us about that journey?
I do think that traveling is one of the things that have helped me wake up because I think it allowed me to see other cultures, other ways of living, but also meeting other people with different perspectives from the ones that I was not subjected to, exposed to on a daily basis in my job. I feel like when you're in a work environment, very often people conform to the same rules, right? Because there's a culture, there's a way of doing things. And so there's less diversity of thought. And so through traveling, through the experiences that I had and the people I met, I think that's what gradually woke me up and gradually allowed me to tap more into myself, become more spiritual, and over time understand myself better.
I do think you're right. It was a process for me too. I think some people have maybe the big moment in their life where something disastrous happens. And in some ways, my divorce was a massive thing, but it still, I think, took several years to kind of unroll. And the waking up, I think, had started just prior to the actual divorce. So the divorce wasn't the reason I woke up, but was more of an effect of waking up. But something came up for me actually that I think people could use that I wish I'd been more aware of and gotten more intentional about, which is I think when we're younger, and you use the word subjected, and actually, I think that might be right in some ways because most cultures, doesn't matter what continent they're on, they have a right way and a wrong way for that culture, right? So you're either
Mm.
inside it and you belong and you check the boxes correctly, and then you have your acceptance, or you don't. We're not born, and then we start looking at what is, at age 6, what is my value? Like, what are my values, plural, sorry. So, like, connection is a big one for me, adventure is another one. Those things are not I think my family's top values. They have other values, which like service to others. They're good values and they are in my top values, but they're not my top 3, let's say. And so you never notice that discrepancy and you just start to think, okay, service to others, that's my top value. And you don't even think about it. It's like this subconscious thing that you absorb. And then if it feels constrictive, and this is the point I want to make, because if it feels constrictive, something doesn't fit right. You put a sweater on and you know it's too small, or the better example is when you put pants on that are too tight and you can barely get that zipper up. And then you think, oh, actually, I'm fitting into my skinny jeans today. So I'm going to wear these. And then you get out of the house. And about an hour after you get out of the house, you're like, fuck, I want to take these off. And all you can think about the rest of the day is literally taking these pants off. And you go in the bathroom and you unzip them. And then you wish you wore a sweater or something that, so the muffin top can spill over because they're still slightly too tight. So even if you don't have a muffin top, because they're so tight, you do in these pants. If it feels constrictive, something's not right. Follow that. Listen to that. I spent so many years trying to stuff that down and say, no, I need to fit into these ridiculously tight pants. There's so many things you can wear, but because everybody around me is wearing pants, that's what I'm wearing, right? It's that thing about, you said traveling. I think that's so true because I started traveling and suddenly going to another country, you realize that actually they do it 100% different. And there's absolutely still the right and wrong, but you don't feel the pressure to constrict yourself into that box because you're not from that culture. But then it opens your eyes to the idea that there is another way of doing it that thinks that it's just as right as the where you come from, that thinks it's right. And they are 100% completely opposite. So then if there's no right way to be, my God, how expansive does that feel? When I started doing that and I started to feel more expansive and started to flow, and man, that took me a long time because the permission. Did you experience the having to give yourself permission?
Constantly. And I think you're definitely right. You're taking yourself when you travel, you take yourself out of your normal context and you put yourself in a new context where you don't have to fit in because you're not gonna stay there, right? And so that gives you the breathing room. It gives you the space to figure out who you are, what you want, because you don't have to conform. You're out of that environment. And when I went on vacation, it felt like putting on the sweatpants for 2 weeks, right? But then you knew that at the end of those 2 weeks, you would have to put on those tight pants again that you don't feel like you fit into anymore. So it was when I actually quit my job and I went traveling that those pants were just thrown away and I could live in the sweatpants in perpetuity.
I do think you walk away with a new point of view, one you didn't have before, because you realize that something's possible. And that leads me back to the idea of community and why community is so important. Because I notice when I surround myself with people, and it's like Glennon Doyle talks about this, she stepped way outside of what she was raised with, what her family knew. They were very Christian. In fact, she says when she woke up to all of this and that she loved Abby and she wanted to leave her husband, she was actually on a speaking tour for her book, which was related to a Christian topic about how to have a good marriage, etc. And she was like, I felt like the biggest imposter. But she talks about the courage to follow that energy, what feels expansive, and how it's like you're on your island. And if you let all the people with their fear onto your island, then they pollute your island, so to speak. And so she pulled up the drawbridge and was like, you're not coming over the moat. You're not coming onto my island with your fear. Get rid of your fear and then you're welcome. And she said that to her parents, to her mother specifically. And so I think about it because every time I want to do something new. So right now I'm in the process of founding a co-living community, which I'm not kidding. The energy around it for me is huge. The rightness of it. It is the chosen family. It is the village that I have always wanted to create. And yet, a lot of the people around me, if I'm not careful and not really aware of this, pollute it with their fear. My mother says, what if people take advantage of you? Oh, if you move in and you make this permanent, how are you going to get out of it? If I go in to trying to do something I love, something that excites me, something that feels right, thinking about all the things that are going to go wrong, well, then those things are going to be called to me and they're going to go wrong. And so I'm really taking that into heart, and I'm not going to lose touch with my mother, but I am very much going to call out that fear and essentially not let it pollute my island because it's not mine. But how many times after spending time with someone, and this is part of my start, stop journey for so long, is that you start and then somebody says, oh, that'll never work. And then you think, oh, actually, maybe they're right. Maybe that's
Mm.
true. I don't have the thing to do this, or this isn't the right timing, or you give yourself so many excuses and you justify and then you stop. And then you go back to those tight pants. When the tight pants get too tight again, all of a sudden you've got to put the sweatpants back on and you start moving towards what lights you up, what feels expansive. And then it's like that pendulum back and forth, back and forth. But what comes up for me is that I think it's a polarity. You need both, actually. I need the certainty, the security that my mother is so concerned about, at the same time that I need the freedom to create something new that has never existed in the world that I've known. I believe communities like this exist everywhere, but not in the people that I know. So it is a balance, and it's just finding that balance. How do you give yourself certainty, safety within the freedom? Where
Mm.
has this idea of balance come up in your life?
I think this is so true, and it's like that saying, "Don't ask people for advice who haven't been where you wanna go, or don't have the same goals that you do." Why would you be asking them for advice? Because they don't want the same things, or they haven't gone where you want to go. And that is something I've also had to learn the hard way. I've made choices in my life that especially my dad has not been impressed by, and that has been really hard because I realized over time how much I needed his validation of my decisions. It's going back to that box. If you let people's fear have power over the decisions that you make, you're gonna feel constricted, you're gonna feel limited, and I remember when I told my family that I was going to buy a tiny house. They were just like, "Okay, we're giving up. This is just silly." But I had been researching that for months, I had been dreaming about it, I had a vision, I was determined this was gonna happen, I wanted that experience. Of course, it tainted the experience to some extent, or it tainted the dream a little bit because when somebody puts their own fear on you or their own judgment on you, you can't help but feel it. But that's when it's so important to tap into that excitement and the why behind the decision that you've made.
I remember when you moved in there, probably the 2 hardest things, tell me if this is right, the 2 hardest things about moving in were that you had to reduce the number of shoes you owned and the number of skincare products. You have more skincare products than I've ever seen someone have. Anyway.
Yeah, that was a it was a challenge, but thank God for storage units, that's all I say. Another thing that's funny is you were saying that your mother was concerned about being exploited, or you go into a situation and then you can't go out. Nobody says that when you move in with a new partner, usually, or when you go into a new job, because those things fit the script. They fit what people expect of you. But when you do something new, something that's uncommon, that's when their fear comes up, and that's when you get those feedback loops. And I think it's just a matter of being aware of that. Like you said, there's a polarity and you just need to hold it. But the awareness is really important, and then having your own back in the decision that you've made and following the joy is really important. And it was for me an incredible adventure. I no longer live in a tiny house. I lived there with my husband for 2 years, and it was great. It was also challenging. It had all the ups and downs, but I am so happy I did it, and it's gonna be a story that I will tell for the rest of my life because it's something that most people don't do, and it brought a lot of joy and a lot of adventure to my life.
Well, you know what comes up for me when you say that is that this idea of getting a new job or moving in with a partner, they are new experiences, but they're experiences within the familiar experiences. So you will grow from them, but it's the experiences that drive the most growth. Doing something that you've never done before, moving to a new country, moving into a situation like a living situation that you've never tried, taking on a job that's way outside of anything you've done before. But what's cool is that that's the exact opportunity outside of that box, outside of that comfort zone that causes you to stretch. And when you stretch, you grow. And when you grow, you experience the world differently. You see the world differently. You model it. You share that possibility, that sense of, I can do this with others. And I think that it's again what we started with, right? You see somebody doing meditation and you don't feel celebratory for them and excited for them when it calls out that gap within yourself. And so to see somebody take on an experience like a tiny house, I think causes people to look at their own identities.
It's modeling what's possible, but then it's also whenever you stretch, whenever you step out of the comfort zone, you build confidence. And that is the only way you build confidence, because as long as you stay in your zone of comfort, you're not going to build confidence because you're not doing something you haven't mastered yet. You're doing the same thing on repeat. And the first step is always the scariest, right? But then over time, you find out that you can do this. Even if it doesn't go exactly the way you imagined it would, you figure it out. And those are the things and experiences that build confidence over time. And that will allow you to take the next big leap.
I love that you say that. And what came up for me when you said that is that idea. It's like the gym. You go to the gym, and if you do the same weight over and over, yeah, you'll stay fit, let's say, but you're never going to expand your capacity unless you shred that muscle with higher weights or doing new things. And then you can suddenly take it to another level. And that's the physical equivalent of that confidence building. But one thing I wanted to actually go back to that I don't want to lose is I think the people who are bringing their fear to our islands, your father, my mother, I don't think they're doing it out of intentionally trying to keep us playing small, intentionally trying to not believe in us, because that is essentially what it is. They are doing it, I think, out of a desire to protect. And I think it's really important to notice that and feel thankful for that and return that love, because it is absolute love. But a lot of times when mom would express her fear, I would internalize it as my own. And then even after I stopped internalizing it as my own and I recognized that it was hers, it wasn't really true for me, I had trouble not following her advice because it would be almost a rejection of her way of doing things, as if I was telling her it wasn't right. And I think it is right for her. It's just not right for me. And so when I welcome that love and I thank her for it, then I free myself. And so the guilt sometimes still comes up, but then I'm able to disappoint her and not abandon myself.
You're absolutely right. I feel like a lot of the narratives, especially that I see on social media, is, don't let them control your narrative and don't ask them for advice. And I recognize that what I said before could be interpreted that way. So thank you for bringing that up, because it's very rarely meant in a negative way. It is intended to keep you safe. It comes from love, and that's very important to recognize. And then, like you said, when you've stopped internalizing it and you realize that it's their narrative, it's not yours, it's still difficult not to get triggered because you feel like it's a judgment on your life, on your decisions. And to take that, process it in the moment, and then respond with love is very difficult, very challenging. It's funny how people say that you can do all the self-development work that you want, but go back to your family context and you're going to be thrown back to your 14-year-old self. It's very important to keep in mind, because most of the people around us, at least for those of us who are lucky to have good people around us, they're well-intentioned.
Well, what's interesting to me is that idea that they're trying to protect us and we're trying to go a different way. That's how we work internally as well. How we function externally with other people is exactly the same way we function inside ourselves, with that idea of the voice that tells you that you can and the voice that tells you that you can't. You have a similar conversation, even if you're not aware of it, in yourself, because it will be your fears, it will be the judgments that come in that you make, and the story that you tell yourself about what is possible for you, and things that are familiar and want to keep you in your comfort zone. And all of these different voices, even if you can't separate them out yet, they work against each other. And a lot of times they keep you paralyzed right smack inside the middle of that comfort zone, even though you want to get out of it, even though you want to grow. I really think that's a cool idea, that those voices that are keeping you stuck, they want to protect you. They want to keep you safe. I guess in my own journey, I didn't make a lot of headway until I finally started saying, thank you, fear. Thank you, judgment, and welcoming that, because they're not trying to harm me. They're not trying to keep me playing small. They are keeping me playing small, or were at the time. But if I fight them, then it's just a massive internal conflict, kind of like you fight those arguments you get in with your dad about whether you can or can't make this a success. I get the same argument with my mother about whether whatever it is possible. And we have those same arguments in our heads. I think about it so many times. If I had just turned to my mother and said, I hear that you want me to be safe and healthy and well and happy, and I love you for that, and I just given her a big old hug, I think that would have cut that conversation right short. And instead, we had a massive argument where we didn't talk to each other for a couple of days, and then, had to sort of repair things. And I just think if we took that approach with other people and with ourselves, life would feel a lot smoother. How much emotional energy do you put into stuff? There have been days earlier in the journey, and even sometimes still now, where I will resist something, and instead of welcoming it, it's an internal conflict, and I just feel emotionally exhausted. And then if I could just say, whew, and accept that is trying to help me, and we're going to find the way through, then it would be a different story. In that experience with the tiny house, what is the thing that you learned about yourself? What did you learn about yourself, and how did you grow? I love the smile that lights up your face as you think about this.
Well, I learned that I can live in small spaces. Let's state the obvious first.
Which is quite funny, because you are not a small person. You're very thin, but you're very tall. Like, when you stretched your arms out, could you touch the sides of the house? Both sides?
No, not quite, because it was 2.5 meters across,
Okay.
so not quite. Yeah, it wasn't far away from it. It did require some bumping your head up in the ceiling when you got out of the bedroom in the morning, but after a while, it's like you grow into the house and you learn where the corners and the the low points are, and you just kind of adapt your movements to it. In the same way you adapt to each other in the way that you move around the house. So you naturally get out of the way for the other person to move around. It happened very naturally. It wasn't something you had to think about. It just kind of molded itself that way. But over time, you realize that, when he moves there, I move there. But I think that the biggest thing it taught me is that I can take something that was just a thought. It was just that would be cool. I was watching these YouTube videos about people living in tiny houses and what amazing lifestyles they had and how they streamlined their lives into a tiny house. But what really struck me was the through line of all of the videos was the sense of freedom. Everyone said they felt a sense of freedom because they had less stuff, they had more time, they had more freedom, both financially and time freedom. And they loved living in this minimalist way. That is the biggest lesson, I think, that I could take something that was just an idea and make it a reality. And I could do that myself, even if the people around me didn't necessarily think it was a great idea. And by doing that, I was making an aligned choice, because one of my top values are freedom. It taught me that when I make values aligned decisions, it improves my life. It makes me feel happier. And even if it wasn't forever, it was an important example that that's possible. What is a values-aligned decision that you've made in your life that has had a great impact on you?
Well, I think there are two, and both are fairly big. I think one of the first ones is the choice to stay in Switzerland. So when I initially came over here, I was married. I followed my husband, my then husband. Certainly wasn't awake at that time, hadn't gone through any kind of awareness and that life was constrictive and the pants weren't fitting quite right. I just knew I wanted to broaden my experience because everything felt so small where I was. And so we moved to Switzerland, and it was only supposed to be for 2 years. And then contracts got extended and it was 4 years. Eventually, he went back and I stayed, and we ended the relationship. And if you think about it, like ending the relationship and living in another country where I have no family that's an ocean away is a decision that certainly my family does not love. It definitely was outside of the comfort zone. But learning a new language, learning how to operate, there was a level of discomfort that was there every single day living in a new country when everything that you do in a day, you don't think about this, but you're on autopilot much of the day. And it forces you, when you live in a new country, to get out of autopilot and stay out of it. And I think that is one of the most valuable things you can do. And a lot of times they call it a beginner's mindset, but it's this idea of if you're not in autopilot, you're learning. You are constantly learning. And that's a top value of mine. I know it's a top value of yours too. It's one of the things that studies show makes people feel the most fulfilled and the happiest, most satisfied with their lives. That's one experience that caused me to grow, to learn that I was capable of doing it by myself, all of it, which is awesome. Because also, oftentimes I find when you're in a relationship, you tend to go with your strengths. You give somebody else responsibility for other things that you then stop growing. So in terms of any of the finances or investments or repairing things, kind of handed that all off to my then husband. It's like these new facets of your identity that you have to uncover and get in touch with again and bring forward. I don't think you ever lose these things, but because like a muscle, if you don't use them over time, they get weaker, they atrophy. And also when you're then away from everything you know and you're constructing something that you've never done before, it opens up freedom in ways you never knew. Because then you start thinking, well, if this is done differently and possible, maybe I could do this. So I really like that when you touched on earlier, that idea of possibility, like living in the tiny house, you see something and you can make it happen. What are you applying that to in your life right now?
One of the identities that I have taken on recently that I would not have imagined previously is investor. When I say the word investor, I see this middle-aged, white, kind of overweight man with glasses and a portfolio under his arm,
You're so
But in
serious.
his portfolio, he's got all these spreadsheets with lots of numbers and he's got a fat bank account. It was not a term that I imagined for myself, but I have now started investing in real estate, which is very exciting and something that I did not imagine. Like, if you told me that 1 year ago that I would be a real estate investor, I would just shake my head and look at you like you were crazy. But it's funny when you just open your mind to the possibility that this could also be something that you can do, and the image that you have in your mind is just that. It's just an image. It's just a preconceived notion. And there are many types of investors out there. There are many types of investments, and you don't have to be a high-flying, super rich, middle-aged man to be an investor. So that's really exciting, and it's a new space where I'm learning a lot, and that is also very scary because, of course, you're putting your capital on the line. It's a practice of taking on calculated risks and stepping into the mindset of building wealth.
I like that thing you said, calculated risk, because it is important that you get outside your comfort zone. But I think it's also important how far outside your comfort zone you go. Have you stretched where you go and you stretch something and it feels a little uncomfortable, but it's okay, it's tolerable? Or sometimes you do that thing where you think you can still do the splits like you could as a child, and you go to do them, and then all of a sudden something pulls or tears, and now it was not funny because you're going to be limping for 2 weeks. I think that's the difference in the comfort zone. Like, if you get something that stretches you, you're in that healthy part, you're going to be able to make yourself do it. You're going to get over that gap. But if the gap is too big, you won't. You'll stay stuck. You'll stay put. What are the stepping stones almost that you could put in place that would help you, if your goal or your whatever is farther outside of your comfort zone than you're comfortable stretching to? What is a stepping stone you could put in place?
Yes, stepping out of your comfort zone is important, and sometimes we have to make big leaps. I have for a long time identified as a very shy person, and I have had big struggles with presenting to audiences. And I remember being asked to make a presentation at work, and that was a massive stretch for me. For others, might not have been, right? It would have just been a small challenge. But for me, that brought up anxiety, it brought up limiting beliefs, it brought up like a whole host of things. And I went into paralysis because I was so afraid of it.
It required
And
an identity shift from you.
exactly. And it was too quick. It was too fast. And I didn't have the support that I needed. And I didn't have the time that I needed to adapt to that. And the presentation went horribly because it was just too soon. It was too much. And stepping into a new identity, there are different bits and pieces of it. And some pieces can fall in place really quickly, and others will take more time. And knowing yourself well enough to know where you can take a big leap and still be okay, or areas where you are going to need a bit more time, I think that is valuable.
I also wanted to come back to some words you said, which is the idea of a preconceived notion, and how much the story that we tell ourselves is what builds our box. And the size of that box, and it's so small that it's this tight little black box around you, is based on your thoughts, right? Your thoughts are the energy that create that story around you, that create your sense of possibility. We don't think about our thoughts that much necessarily, but there are thoughts that run through your mind all of the time. I did a podcast episode recently where I used the idea of a cowgirl because that comes from Oklahoma. But if you are not rounding up those negative thought doggies, right? They call cattle sometimes doggies. And it makes sense as well because they use dogs sometimes to round up cattle. But rounding them up and herding them right on out is very important, because otherwise those runaway thoughts that you're not even necessarily that conscious of change how you see the world, what you see as possible. They are an energy that keeps you playing small. And I think I didn't round mine up for many years. And they told me things like, you can't do that. They told me that I wasn't a person of impact. And so when I would dare to do something that had required more impact, they would tell me it wasn't possible, that it wasn't for someone like me to do. And that kept me playing small. I didn't dare to start my own business. And then once I started my own business and I started thinking differently and I started really working on those thoughts, then co-founding a second business with you was easy. It's the difference between thinking you can do it and thinking you can't. And of course, if someone had asked me, can you do this? I would say, well, I've got the education, I've got the will, I've been in situations that I didn't know before and I've figured it out. So yes, sure, technically, I think I can do it. But if that thinking is just theoretical knowledge that feels outside of yourself versus that embodied feeling of, I can do this, how cool is this? Then you don't act. And it changes all future outcomes. It changes your future. And I watch people who are in my life now who think about, I'm terrible, I'm no good at this. And those are the type of thoughts that run through their mind all the time. It limits how they show up in life. It affects their mood. It affects every aspect of what they're doing, the energy that they bring to things. And then it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. They prove themselves correct. They think they can't do it, so then they cannot do it. And it's because it makes you go in that pendulum we talked about earlier, where you start for yourself and then you stop, and then you start, and then you stop, and then you start, and you stop, and you don't make any headway. And then you say, see, I knew that. Yes, you did know that. You created that.
One of the things that I really like about working with you and working together on the business is humor. You are really good at bringing humor into self-development work, and I think that is a piece that is missing a lot in this space because it feels like something that can be very heavy, and it can be very heavy. But I think we're not good enough at using humor as an element of bringing lightness to it, making it more fun, making it more accessible. How do you think about that, and how do you bring humor into the space?
Oh my God. I totally believe self-development work is so fun. I get a huge thrill out of it. And people are looking at me like I'm crazy because, I mean, why is it fun? You literally have to break your identity and jump outside your comfort zone. It feels like you're in free fall. Yes, it can. It absolutely does. But it doesn't have to, both in how we handle it, but also what we choose to surround ourselves with, right? So if you're doing this in the company of women, like we do in Extraordinary Lives, where you're laughing all the time through the pain. They've shown that laughter actually is one of the things that turns off the stress, turns on the rest and digest. You begin to get curious, you learn, and those are the things that you need to turn on to navigate through massive change. That is what is required when you shift an identity. And when I went through my divorce, I didn't know. Right? I wasn't awake, and this thing was serious, and it was hard, and it was painful, and this idea that you can weather experiences like this with joy and humor was way beyond me. And I would have told you to fuck off. And that was ridiculous. And you just didn't get me. And now I look at it and I think that was my choice at the time. I wanted to choose to suffer. And now I don't want to choose to suffer. And so actually, I'm not going through a divorce because we didn't get married, but I am going through a separation right now. And to be able to do that with joy and laugh through it and find community and find connection, and even with the partner that we are splitting, you know, and it isn't perfect. It isn't every day or every moment. Usually I will have laughter every day. Yes. It's just not in every moment. For me, the key thing is in connecting with something beyond yourself. When you connect with something bigger and you realize that millions of people have gone through separation and divorce, millions of people have gone through an identity shift where they're thrown into a situation at work, like you were talking about, that demands that they change and in such a short span that they can't do it and they fall on their face in front of everybody. When you can pull yourself out of what you're going through alone and you can realize that you're not alone and you can touch the experience and share that experience in community like we do, when you are surrounded by women that you respect and women who've been there and who've done that, and they hold you on the times that you need to cry, but then they also champion you and say, girl, you got this. I know that right now you're face down in the mud and you've got splatter all over your hair, but you're going to get up and we're going to walk across this finish line together. We've been there too, and we know it's possible, and we see your strength. I think that makes it possible to laugh. Also, I find laughter is so contagious. When you start laughing, people start laughing with you. It's a healing almost. And I think that's the biggest joy of doing it together in community, is that you realize that it's not so serious and you're not alone. The journey itself is beautiful. I look back at this journey and all these negative things that have happened, right? Divorce, my son being diagnosed with autism, separating with his father, leaving my job and not knowing that I was going to found my own business and kind of having a lot of uncertainty around, oh my God, what am I going to do to bring in money? You look at all of these negative things that happen, and I wouldn't take any of them back because I think I've managed to find purpose in the pain. How are they helping me grow? How are they helping me stretch? And what new facets of myself do I find that I then use? And when you realize this, then you don't mind the growth because you know in the middle of that pain, you are literally building the other side of the coin. because joy and sorrow are two sides of the same coin, right? Safety and security, and then freedom, two sides of the coin. So where you're tossing about in insecurity, but you're building your freedom. Where you are sad or so upset about something, you're building your joy, because the depth of both is linked. So the more that you go through these experiences, the more awesome the good experiences are. And I don't know, I find metaphors help a lot. So, like, thinking about myself walking around in tight pants and how I really don't wanna do that, and, like, seeing the muffin top spill over really just makes me laugh, and I think, "Ugh, I don't want that." So, yes, I think laughter is a huge thing, and I feel so grateful to our community and to growing together and laughing together. Because when you don't feel alone, you get to feel more curious, you get to feel more alive.